This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 363, Working Within Your Values. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about working within your values with our guests, Cathy Theys and Tess Flynn. Cathy is a longtime Drupal contributor. She helped the Drupal mentoring program at conferences scale and also worked a bunch on getting Drupal 8 released. She is currently working as support team manager at Lullabot in the support and maintenance department, where she wears a lot of hats. She is sometimes a team lead, sometimes project manager, and sometimes a developer. Cathy, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us for the last 4 episodes. This is
nice to be back.
This is your last episode, your show, as we like to call it. So you've been great, and we appreciate your time and energy.
Thanks.
Also joining us, Tess is a longtime Drupal developer, blogger, and speaker. She has contributed to Drupal core, several Drupal modules, and is a DevOps engineer at 10.7. Tess,
Hello.
Welcome to the show. And Tess, I think I'm fair in saying this. You are the first person from 10.7 that we've had on the show.
It's a small company.
Hopefully the first of many more. We'll see. For those of you that don't know, I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and my co-host today is Nick Laughlin, founder of Enlightened Development. Nick, how are you?
Good afternoon. I'm doing great. Looking forward to the show.
As am I. Before we get to our primary topic and talk about our values, let's dive into the module of the week.
Yeah,
let's try not to mess this up. Representative image. Cathy, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this module makes a field on all content types and stuff where you can fill in an image and associate that with the type. And then later, if you want to use it, like in a view or in your theme, on your node pages, if you want to, you can use that representative image for that type. So if all of your types
now we get it. So, dear listener, the reason Nick and I have both had an epiphany is we tried to bring this module of the week to you last week, and we were kind of like, well, doesn't Core already do this? And then Cathy was like, well, hold on to it, and I'm going to go learn more about it, and then I'll come back. And now I think we're both getting that it's a representative image for the entity, not the node or the taxonomy term. It's not per thing, it's overall.
Per bundle.
Exactly.
If it's
extremely helpful, entity. Right?
Yeah. So like say you I run into this often where I'm viewing a node or I'm editing a node and I'm like, I wish I knew what kind of node this was.
Yeah.
And like sometimes if you like you can do things with URL aliases, or you can put like admin clues in or something, but you can also put an icon in these things, and then on those pages use that icon, and then that can help you have a quick visual clue to be like, what is this?
Like, I imagine it working well with like search results, right? Where you get like a bunch of search results back and you want to like have iconography per search result. Like it's a lot easier.
Results have different types of things in them.
Well, right. Yes. So like your search results are bringing back media taxonomy, all that sort of stuff. That's okay. Yeah, this is great. I feel like I want to use that now, like on everything, but I don't know.
The other thing it does, which a lot of Contrib modules do, but since this is my last show, I'm gonna lean into it a little bit.
Go for it.
Is it because it's a contributed module, and people can reuse it. Even if it was something that was like pretty easy to code up yourself, custom code, there's still a lot of advantages to using a Contrib module. And one of them is like like this module provides a field. So the field has a label, help text, things like that. It's set up because it's open sourced and has been improved by people over time. Like those things are translatable. And if you were hacking together a module like this and your website only used one language, you might not spend the extra time to do some of these like Drupal best practices. But by using a Contrib module, you can not only get the functionality, but also Drupal's best practices. And if there was an accessibility issue or something, and it was fixed in the module, right? And people were using the mod, so it's just the open source thing, I guess.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's also, at its root, right? It's adding a field to an entity, which is like super helpful in the fact that you don't have to kind of build a module to do that, right? Because like I imagine that entity form itself, or the building of that. Well, let me ask you that. That's a great question. Have you installed it? And like, what's the UI like to do this? Is it like its own config page, or does it add it to like the content type creation page, or like how does that work?
That I don't know. So
okay,
we'll have to just encourage people to try it out.
Yeah, go play with it. That's the best part about Drupal, right? All right. Well, I appreciate that. Great module of the week. And, maybe next week we'll get back into tables, because I think I got another table related module. So let that be a teaser for you. So let's jump into our primary topic here and start off our conversation. So every one of us has certain values and principles that we bring to our work, right? Today, we want to kind of discuss, how we work within those values, and also provide some tips for what to do if we're put in a situation where our values may be compromised. With that, and focusing on our values, we all make hundreds of choices throughout our day. Cathy, kick us off with an answer to this. What guides those choices, and how might that impact our coworkers, our clients, the end users of our work, just people in general?
Yeah, right. Like hundreds of decisions. What guides them? So when I have to make a decision, I usually will consult the doc. I'm always kind of looking to see if there's a doc that'll be helpful for me. I kind of have a heuristic at work that's like, who does this affect? Like, gather some more information. Is this impacting internal people inside my own small team? Is this other coworkers that I have? Is this a customer? Is it like an end user?
So it's like an evaluation matrix.
Yeah.
Okay.
And think about a little bit about the cost. Like, how much time are these different things gonna take? And the impact around them. And some things are pretty straightforward. But I think when I start to get confused or nervous, or it feels like there's a mismatch between how people are thinking about the problem or what direction they want to go in, then I think that's where I'm trying to reach for values, and where I might be like, well, if we're thinking about different paths forward here and we're having a hard time like being logical about it, like maybe we take a step back and we try and say, well, what are we trying to accomplish, or what value might be we reach for?
So can we take a step back for a second?
Yes,
because you mentioned
that was very long and rambly.
So you mentioned docs. Can you clarify, when you say you try to find a doc for a decision that comes to you, what kind of documentation are you looking for? Is it internal? Is it something personal? Is there a website? Is there a blog? Like, what do you mean by doc?
Yeah, I'll take anything, really. So a Google asking a question or like typing, it can really reveal a lot of useful information that might be an article. It could be a decision doc. Like, for example, Lullabot has ADRs
Yes.
that are public.
I have seen and heard of those. So it's basically like a decision log. Like, hey, we made this decision because of X, Y, and Z, right?
Yeah.
What's an
And so
ADR
that
name?
might be, oh, go ahead, Tess.
What's an ADR?
Oh,
What's it stand for?
Architectural Decision Record. Here, I'll put a link. So that would be like, but there are similar things we run into a lot where it might be like a previous issue we worked on that was similar to a thing that we're doing now, right? And if it's like, oh, well, that can be like a doc in a sense. To be like, why did we make this decision last time? What was the motivating thing? And what was the solution we went to? And what were the like repercussions of that? Could be encompassed in an issue too.
So to summarize, it sounds like you look for historical kind of statute to kind of validate the decision, right? And then you kind of look at the values that you or your company have, and then evaluate how those values, like how a client or a coworker or the people in the situation are going to be kind of impacted by those decisions.
Yeah.
Is that fair? A fair assessment?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so Tess, can you tell me a little bit about what your decision-making process kind of looks like too? Like, do you follow a similar pathway? Do you look for previous documentation? Do you just think about it internally? Like, what's your process like?
So it's a little bit more informal, probably because we're a much smaller organization. But typically the first thing that happens is what I would call research in general. So that could be looking for possible solutions, looking for what is considered, the conventional or typical solution for a particular thing. And then I was thinking about this earlier this week and realized that there's kind of 3 levels that I go through after that, which is the first level is, would this technology or process that we come up with or whatever it is that we're trying to figure out, would that actually technically work? Would it actually do the thing that we want it to do?
Yeah.
It's a bare minimum. Like, sure, okay, you can run your web server out of, an x86 from 1982 or something like that, but it's probably not gonna work too well. Yeah. So you want to have at least a technically viable solution. And the next question that I usually go to is this particular decision that we make, the result of which, would it feel right for us as an organization, for the corporate culture in which that we currently have? And that's a little bit more difficult because a lot of technologists don't tend to think about corporate culture all that much. They're not really used to that. I'm a weirdo because when I went to college, I crossed to this one invisible line constantly between the social sciences and computer sciences, and nary did the two cross, except for me, 3 times a day. And so I often think about that and finding the decision that works for the team, that feels good, that works for the kind of organization that you are and feels like it's nice, is important.
Yeah. So I think I don't think that. Well, I don't know. I guess your statement about it being abnormal to kind of think of the corporate values is
or
maybe
uncommon.
Not uncommon,
at least.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I don't know. I've always thought that way myself too. Like I've always been very, focused on like corporate values and mission statements. But I think that's important. Like, and I think we're gonna dive into that more as we go through the show today. But like, I've always looked at that as kind of like a decision making part of my decision making. And I think one thing that I want to highlight here is that throughout the show, we're gonna not only talk about how values shape our decisions around technological solutions, right? But they could also shape our decisions around corporate governance or policies that our companies enact. In my previous role, we had a lot of input into kind of those company related policies and values. So, I'd be interested to hear more about that as we go on.
Well, but before we move on, because I have another question, but before we move on, you mentioned there were 3 things that you kind of consider. What was the third? What was the third thing?
The third one is the one that I don't think that we as technologists are particularly good at, which is this the ethically, communally responsible decision to make? Sure, we can onboard, say, this third-party provider, but what kind of ramifications does that have for the society at large? Do they support things that we flatly do not want to support? Do they do that vicariously under the table? Do they do other nasty things? Do they support individuals which also do nasty things?
Yeah.
And a lot of organizations don't want to consider that because it gets in the way of making the decision, getting it over with. And as long as it technically works and does what we want, it's not our problem. It is our problem. There is no disconnection between all of us. We are all interconnected, and making those decisions and continuing to ignore when we've made poor decisions with third-party providers or particular technologies which have negative social consequences is just continuing to contribute to those negative social consequences.
Yeah, I think it's important too to call out like the types of decisions and situations that we're talking about too, because there's different levels. One of the things that Cathy said that I think really is important is like, who does this decision impact, or if I make this decision and go one way or the other, who does that impact? Because a lot of these hundreds of decisions really have no consequence, right? For example, some design level things like whether something is one shade of blue or another, probably in most cases isn't that important. And presenting that to a customer, if they're going to make a decision one way or the other, that's not really going to pull your values or their values or the company values into the situation. But maybe if there's pushback, if they, I've had these, you have a review with the client, it goes poorly, they respond really negatively. Well, now values are involved because you have how do you respond to that criticism? How do you respond personally? How do you respond as the company? And how do you make sure that, those values are in alignment? Or if they're not in alignment, how do you do it in a way that, I'll just use myself because I don't want to, like, if somebody says something to me, says something rude to me, right? And it's a personal friend, I'll respond differently than if it's in a professional capacity. There are also some things in a professional capacity that, I will make a stand and say, hey, professionally, that's not acceptable. But in a personal relationship or friendship, it is acceptable. So it's not just like, what are the values? It's also, what are the contexts that these values exist in, and what is that layering?
I think like another example there to kind of bring it to like a project basis, right? One thing that came right to my mind was while Tess was delivering her third point was that, like, imagine you're working with a client, and we've all worked with clients. Like, that's kind of what we do, right? Imagine working with a client and the client says, hey, we're going to bring in this, this agency to do design, right? And let me preface this by saying this is based in no reality. This is a completely made up scenario. And that firm that they're bringing in, or that agency that they're bringing in, like, as the developer or solution architect or whatever your position is on the project, that they they don't respect, accessibility principles. They don't design with those in mind. They don't, they just kind of like, yeah, whatever, we're going to do our own thing. Right. You on that project, you have well, personally, I feel that you would have a responsibility to kind of inform the client of that. And then, then the client has to evaluate whether that's important to them or not. Right. So that's kind of like the type of scenario that I think we could be talking about here. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. That's a great example. And it does always come back to your own personal values too. Because let's say they bring in that design firm, the design firm doesn't take accessibility into account. Accessibility is very important. Then you go to the client goes, oh yeah, accessibility is not important to us either. Well, then the decision is, are you okay with that?
Right. Yeah. So I think like the process, right, of like maybe recognizing a situation, bringing it up with a group, right, like, and adjusting it can ripple through a few different layers, and that can take time, which can make things more expensive. Yeah. Yep. And then your values start conflicting.
And I mean, there are instances where like, and maybe this is kind of the approach that I've always taken is like, listen, if I've done my due diligence and I've informed the client of the risk that I see, and they turn around to me and say, well, for this project, accessibility isn't important, then like, maybe I say, okay, well, I've done my best to inform you. I've done my best to identify the risks. Like, there isn't much more I can do at this point. But to be fair, at a company level, like there could be an instance where, depending on the company you work for, right, and their mission and their values, right, they say, well, we don't work with folks that don't, implement accessibility principles. So, I think, Cathy, to your point, like it hits on a couple of different levels, and throughout our conversation today, hopefully we can kind of hit on some of those and provide maybe some tips for folks to be able to say, hey, this is how we rationalize this, or this is how we kind of like work around or within that situation.
And that's my exact next question, Cathy. We can start with you. Is how do you maintain your own personal values in the workplace? Like, how do you go about negotiating that?
So at Lullaby,
it's an easy question. It's an easy question, right?
yeah, super easy. I'm not sure. Like, I have done a lot of different things in my life, and at one point was trained in nonviolent communication, and that's kind of permeates a lot of my interactions. So I will use some techniques from that to help me talk about my values. So when I get conflicted, I find somebody else to talk to.
Sure, okay.
That's one thing that I do. But we've got this new cool thing at Lullabot that we have been trying called Healthy Minds at Work, which is an app that combines guided meditation with some education. And it's helping me practice in small situations, thinking about things from other people's perspectives, or what might motivate them. Like, why is the other person motivated to feel strongly about this? And so, like, so how do I maintain my values requires that, first of all, I know what they are, which is a little difficult. So I might talk to somebody, but then once, like, as I'm talking about it and I can articulate them, then I can turn it around the other way and flip my mind, instead of centering on me, centering on the other person's values.
Let me ask you a question there. So when you have or having conflict or a crisis of conscience, right? And that sounds, I guess, way more drastic than maybe it is. It could be very, very simple, right? But like, do you typically try to find somebody has the same values as you, or do you try to find somebody that has different values to try to gain a different perspective on it?
I will usually look for somebody that I know will explore, like, be a good listener. That's what I'm looking for. Is typically for somebody to like help facilitate the struggle that I'm wrestling with. Mm-hmm. And so that person could share my values or not. If they're have some skills to do that facilitating, then it will usually work out.
So it's almost like in conflict resolution, you hear a lot about like a mediator, right? Bringing in an impartial third party to kind of like talk through the problem and understand both sides. Like it's kind of like that person without the other person in the room, right? Am I describing that correctly? Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so how about you, Tess? How do you go about maintaining your values in the workplace?
I'm not nearly as successful as Cathy, I think. I try, and sometimes I will make impassioned pleas, but at the end of the day, I am extraordinarily cognizant of what the power dynamic is in any employment situation, and that leads me to rely on where the wind is blowing in some cases. And it's not necessarily my favorite thing. And I have lost some sleep over that at times, but it is unfortunately something that happens. I'm not nearly as embedded in a lot of decision making as, say, Cathy might be. So it depends on where you are in the organization, what kind of decisions are being made. And sometimes the decision is already made for you and you weren't even given any notice or input or even knew there was a discussion being had. And in that case, you just have to kind of say, what you think the potential concerns are with it, and just see what happens afterwards.
Right. And so, sometimes, and I guess that's kind of like the, where I typically come down is like, you have to be able to sleep at night, right? And you have to be able to kind of live with yourself. So, I mean, you have to kind of evaluate, right? Like how bad is this situation, or how much does this conflict with what I believe or what I think is the right thing to do? And kind of walk that line. I mean, I think that's something everybody has to do, like no matter who you are or what you do, right? It's not just like a tech dev problem, right?
Yeah. And there's definitely gradations of that too. Like, for example, I have clients that refuse to discuss accessibility, and I'll still work with them, and I just make sure that anything that I touch is accessible,
right?
And like skunk working.
And he's making changes from within.
And I push hard for, if there's some design thing or a functionality thing that really isn't accessible, I raise that flag every single time. Be a thorn in the side, let them know. But there are other hard lines. So the gist of it is, like, there are other projects where there's requirements that I'll just say, like, I am not going to implement that feature, right? This is not something that I'm comfortable with doing. And it really depends on the client, the project, the customer. Many times they'll just have, I'm sure, many clients will just have another developer work on that project. And it'll get done anyway. But like John said, you have to be able to sleep at night. If there's something that touches on a core value of yours that's important enough, you have to find, when's the right time to make that stand. Who do you talk to? How do you approach that? I mean, these are all very difficult decisions. And, they're also not generally decisions that happen very often either. Like the kind of, I'd say in my career, in 15 years, there's only been like one or two times where I've had a discussion with somebody that's like, okay, I'm not going to do that because I'm not comfortable with the direction it's going. Right. many times if you're not going to do the project, it's because you're just not a good fit for it. It's not like an ethical, like, okay, that's just not ethical.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be able to justify it too, right?
Yeah.
So like you have to like, and I imagine, any of us, if we had an issue or didn't feel that something was appropriate, like we would come to that conversation probably with facts or maybe another workaround. But like, the root question here was like, how do you maintain your values in the workplace? And I think like there are many ways that you can do that, and severity is obviously one of them. But I also don't think you can go into every situation with like pulling the ripcord if like things don't go your way, right?
We
like,
need to make a living.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So like
That's
your
true.
resume. Sorry, Tess, what were you saying?
That's very true. Throughout this entire conversation, I am actually thinking of one thing that I still consider a win to this day. And I'll try to keep it, as general as possible. I had a client who wanted to implement a search function. And their requirement was, well, when we do this search, we want them to immediately go to the most local results. And so they naturally wanted to go to GeoIP. And I see Cathy's face right now, the face that she's making. And I'm sitting here thinking, one of the best security tenets that you can have is no one can steal data that you don't collect. Now, if your entire purpose is to reduce the initial default search screen to the most local results, a lot of people actually find that creepy. And this was years ago, before that became much more common, and the sense of creepiness was pervading most of our daily experience.
When it became a feature, not a creepy factor.
A feature by some people. So I actually really had to take a discussion with the client that, implementing this is going to be technically a lot more time. It's going to be a lot more brittle. It's going to require you to collect data either temporarily or permanently on individuals, which might not be something that you want to risk the responsibility for possible exposure. So in which case we sat and talked about it, and we found out that what really worked is, well, you're going to probably go to the site on one of the several different language domains that this site is on. Why don't we just select let's just guess the country you're in based on the domain that you land on, and we don't deny you looking at anything else. And it's not that creepy because you entered the domain in the first place. Yeah. And it's still pretty broad.
Was the issue with the specificness, like how localized they wanted to be? Like, hey, we want to
reduce travel distance.
Okay. So it was like within the town as opposed to like country or, state.
Right. And
got it.
That really did not feel like something that this particular site really should be doing. It raised way too many creepy factors for me. And I was glad that we were able to reach a compromise in that case. And I felt very good about that compromise. Years later, I still feel really good about that compromise.
Yeah.
What a good example.
Yeah, that is a great example. And it's interesting because I actually was thinking of personalization as Nick was talking, because like that's an area where you are tracking cookies run rampant, and you are collecting building profiles on folks. So that could be a really good example use case as well. I just mentioned pulling the ripcord, right? Like if you're at the point where you're like, my values do not match with where I work or the client I'm working on, like there's the thermonuclear option of quitting, right? Finding a new job. Not always, probably not always the best thing, right? Especially if you're kind of taking that approach all the time. I wouldn't recommend that. But I guess the question is, if you do decide to go that route and you need to find a new company to work for, like, can you guys provide, and Tess, I'm gonna actually point this one to you first. Do you have any kind of like tips as to how you can make sure that the company that you're interviewing with or that you're working for is kind of a value match to your own?
So this immediately makes me think of some of my cultural anthropology training, and the first thing that I came to is you don't talk to the leaders, because the leaders have a particular opinion on what their organization is. I want to talk. I usually like talking to the people who are on the factory floor, as it were. I want to talk to someone who is in the daily grind, just doing their job, and talk to them about the company and the position, because that would probably give me a better lived experience than someone who is the leader of the organization, who has marketing concerns and is trying to onboard, particular individuals into their organization. And I find that getting that in situ source is probably the best way forward to actually get that understanding. Because what a company says they are and what a company is very often different. And some are very good at being as close as possible to that, and others are not. And sometimes that depends on how large the organization is as well.
So let me ask you this. I just want to piggyback on that for 1 second, right? So, you're suggesting not talking to, say, the CEO or the founder or whatever, but talking to kind of the folks on the ground, people like, the devs that are implementing things. Now, is the suggestion there maybe of getting a spectrum, right? So like talking to, if you have access to talk to the CEO or the hiring manager or whoever you would report to, talking to them, and then also talking to that kind of boots on the ground person to kind of get both ends of that spectrum.
It's always a good idea to try to generate a holistic picture in any case. It's just that I tend to weight the person on the factory floor a lot more heavily than all of the other material that I would get, because they're the ones who are living that experience day to day. And those are the experiences I'm most interested in, which are probably going to be most like mine if I were working there.
They're the Amazon drivers peeing in bottles in their cars is what you're getting at.
You want to talk to them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You can learn a lot about any social organization, be it a company, a town, or organization, a state, or a country, about how it treats its most marginalized individuals.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those things that you have to think about too. Like your values won't necessarily be challenged or questioned day to day. But knowing where in the chain of command, so to speak, your values diverge will kind of indicate how often they'll be challenged. Like if your boss has the exact same values as you and his boss has the exact same values as you and the CEO has the exact same values as you, well, you're probably not going to get any situations where your values are challenged. But if at every level, if your values immediately diverge, then those values will be challenged maybe on a daily basis, because it's also like, what kind of organization are you working for? Like if you're if you're working for if you're working for an organization where your values align exactly with the organization, you're going to be working probably for companies and clients that also have the same values. Now, if you're working for a corporation that their values are exactly diametrically opposite, the types of projects you'll be working on will be challenging your core values as well. So
my time at Luton Plunder Evil Co. was not very great.
Nick, I think that's a very valid point. I've always worked for smaller organizations that that were involved with nonprofits and the arts and education, right? That type of those types of industries, like if you're working for a nonprofit, like you have a pretty good idea that like your values align pretty closely with the company's mission, right? I think, previous to my current position, I think we all work at relatively small companies, right? Cathy, I kind of want to point to you and on my last question, and actually bring in something that Nick talked about earlier, right? So, obviously you're a Lullabot, you're a bot, right? And Lullabot's an employee-owned company.
Right.
I'm wondering, obviously, like, I'm assuming here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but like I'm assuming that you as an employee owner have some say in like the values of the company and the types of work that the company does. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I'm not sure how being employee owned is changing much of that, because
Oh, really?
right before Lullabot became employee owned, I would say we already had
You were
like
already
a
doing
feedback
it.
system
Yeah.
for doing it, and I'm not quite sure how being employee owned is going to affect that, aside from generally right now, people who work at Lullabot seeing that there could be a reason to care outside of your strict job tasks.
Yep.
When you view yourself as an employee owner, you are more interested in what customers your company is accepting.
Right.
And so we have Lullabot values, and they're another document that I go to when I'm struggling about what to do at work.
Yeah. So I think, sorry, Nick, I just want to follow up on what Cathy said there, but like, I think like, one thing that, Lullabot is a newer company to employee ownership. You just said that, right, Cathy? But it also shows that the leadership has faith in the employee base to say like, we want to give you, a stake, a position at the table, if you would, right? And I think that's valuable too, right? So one thing I wanted to kind of touch on here is Tess and Cathy both work for smaller companies, right? And we talked about kind of like having the ability to kind of go to the CEO. I know in my previous role, I had direct access to the CEO of our company. And, in my current position, like we're a huge company, so direct access isn't necessarily happening, but we do have town halls. We do have abilities to kind of ask questions up to the, to that level. And, my boss supports me in that way. But I guess my question for Tess and Cathy here, going back to that kind of like matching with a company thing, was that, the fact that you could, Tess, reach out to Yvonne or Cathy reach out to Matt, right? Was that part of kind of the deciding factor when you kind of made the choice to join the companies you're with?
No, I was much more practically minded at the moment.
Okay, that's fair.
Fair enough.
There's a story there, but I'd rather not tell it here.
That's fine. Totally acceptable. Cathy, what about you?
No, I wasn't like, hey, this is great. I can ask Matt a question. My criteria was how many hours a week am I expected to work? Is it remote? And does the company have a history of resolving conflicts internally in a productive, fair way? Now, that last third one is a hard one to identify from the outside.
Absolutely.
Because like we're this Drupal podcast, right? So like Drupalers before the pandemic, we met in person, so we could socialize with people who worked at other companies in these community events. And we can still do that online to be like, hey, I see you work for this company. Can you tell me about, how they handled a internal thing like this or that? But it's a lot harder to approach. I don't know. For some people, it's harder to.
Well,
it's just like you can't, without being an insider already dialed into the community, the resources for people to try and figure that out are quite limited.
The other thing too is whether it's good or bad, having a conversation with somebody somewhat informally, telling them about internal stuff is very different than putting it in writing, right? Like, yes. I mean, if somebody were to ask me about I think a lot harder about what is acceptable to share over Slack with somebody versus having a conversation with somebody, because who knows what's going to happen in the future, right? I mean,
it's a data store that Tess was talking about, right? Like you you type something in somewhere and that data is somewhere.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, maybe don't collect that data. So, finding opportunities to really talk to people is still valuable.
Yeah. So one of the questions I have for the two of you is, when there is a conflict, what's kind of the process that you take, at work to resolve that? Do you talk to your boss? How do you decide when it's something that you just decide to deal with it versus this is something I should talk to the boss versus this is something I should try to discuss company wide? How do you determine, I guess, the gravity of a particular, because even if it's a good value and it's something you should be doing, there's value in bringing that up as a company wide thing and be like, hey, this is a good thing we did. We should try to do more of it. Although, in most cases, when people are talking about their values, they're talking about when something doesn't align. But when do you, how do you decide the gravity of a particular value or decision? How do you think about that? Or is that something you've ever thought about before?
I mean, to me, it's always a case-by-case basis. The judgment of just how invested am I in having this thing happen or not happen, depending on what it is. What are the consequences of that? What are the risks involved with that? And each one of those goes into a massive amount of calculation in order to figure out where you actually stand on that sort of a situation. So there's no easy, direct answer for that. You really do have to feel it out on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, one of the factors I think I use is if it's come up before. So if it seems, small and a first-time thing, maybe I'll talk to one person. If it's a repeated thing, and maybe I'll loop in some more people. Maybe some people on the same team. Maybe I'll pull in somebody else. If it seems like afterwards, some resolution we came to, we've got something we learned from it, maybe we would recommend this in the future or not recommend it in the future. Some kind of a little mini retrospective, not full retrospective, but hey, we did a thing and this is how it worked out. That kind of thing I think is really nice to share really widely.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that's a little bit funny about this particular show is we're talking about decision making in a way that people don't generally process decisions like this. There are some times where I have to stop and think about a decision, and we do, we said at the top of the show, we do make hundreds of decisions a day. The truth is, though, most of those decisions are I've already made a decision like this before. I'm going to make it again that way. And I think for a lot of people, like you were saying, Tess and Cathy, it's a case by case basis. I think in many cases, if a client comes to me and says, hey, I want to do this thing, and I'm a little hesitant about it, generally I will side on okay, I have a couple of reservations. Here's what they may be, but let's do it and see what happens, right? And that's the kind of thing, because if you don't know, you don't know. You don't want to be you don't want to just be no way. You do want to be open to new way of doing things and trying new things. Now, sometimes there's analogs you can look at and be I know this is going to be a bad idea because we did this other thing very similar and that was a bad idea. But many times these decisions are okay, this isn't something that I have to decide one way or the other. we can execute on this plan, and then we can review it after. And I think that's valid too. Like, I don't think the result of this discussion we're having isn't to try to give people the kind of analysis paralysis. We don't want people thinking about every single decision every day and the consequences and who's affected, right?
Oh my God, that sounds exhausting. And like, I feel like my brain would explode if I did that.
Well, it's true. I mean, people can only, and Tess, it sounds like you have a lot more social training than I do. So you probably have something, but people can only handle so many factors at one given time or time period, right? You need to ration your mental energy as well.
You need to decide, is this fight worth it? And sometimes it just isn't. Sometimes you'll go, I don't really have a very big stake in this. I have a concern. Here's my concern. And then you might say, but we can try it anyways and see what happens. Because you can always be wrong. And that's always true. You can, in fact, be wrong about a lot of decisions that you try going into a particular way of doing things, and you go, no, I don't really like this. I don't like the idea of this. And then later on, you're like, you know what? This is actually working out. It's fine. We'll just go with that. Or sometimes you might go, it almost works, but, and then you need to kind of refine that process.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing when it comes to decisions and avoiding decision paralysis is to always know that every decision is temporary.
Mm-hmm.
If you do not live in an environment which decisions are temporary, everything becomes way too terrifying, and you do end up with decision paralysis. It's important to foster a corporate culture of being able to be introspective, to review those decisions, to see if they work, and then be willing to try different things if it didn't work, or do the same thing but differently if it kind of worked. It's always important to make sure that no decision is ever 100% final. It is only what we're doing right now.
Yeah. I think any time I've had conversations about, corporate governance, corporate policy, like how things are handled internally, right? It's always been in the frame of like, hey, let's do this for a little bit, like 6 months, 3 months, whatever the time frame is, maybe even a week, like, who knows, and like, let's revisit this and make sure it's working. In the past, I was tasked with working out like a open source contribution policy, and like that was kind of the process taken, was like, okay, let's put our company values into this, let's put individual values into this, and let's see what we come up with, but then let's reevaluate after 3 months or 6 months, and then after a year. And like, you definitely need to do that stuff. One thing that you mentioned, Tess, I think it was Tess, but was like, it doesn't have to be a fight. And I think like you shouldn't frame it as a fight to start with, right? Like, you should frame it as like, I have this concern. I'm going to go talk to, X, Y, and Z person, and, share my concern, share the facts or the information around the concern. But like, I think sometimes people jump to that, or prematurely escalate things to a point where it makes the conversation harder, right?
So the thing is that I'm generally fairly conflict avoidant is the problem. And so any amount of conflict feels like a fight to me. So I'm being subconsciously hyperbolic when it comes to that sort of a situation. That having any sort of discord at all can be rather upsetting with that particular background, and that comes from my background.
And that, that's different for everybody, right? So like, there are probably plenty of people that share that point of view where they're like, I just do not love conflict, and it just feels like that bigger issue, right?
And that's why I think it's also important to make sure that you have, this is something that happened in like in many forms, like in college and in training. Like, sometimes I'll have a question, and even if I think I'll get the answer later, like, having that discussion and being the first one to stand up and say something, many times if you have misgivings, other people do, and that gives them an opportunity to then contribute, their thought process behind it too. Whereas sometimes people are uncomfortable being the first one. If there's 3 or 4 people in a meeting and everybody just kind of like, and all 4 of them have concerns about the same thing, but each one of them is afraid to like bring it up, well, the thing will happen. But if somebody says, hey, wait a minute, why don't we question this process? I have this concern. If all 4 of them are like, you know what, me too, well, then it's much easier to go back to the drawing board. But like Tess said, you and Cathy, like, you also don't want to be known as the roadblock, right? Because then that also is like, when you have a concern that's closer to your values and more important, it's harder for you to then stand up and say, hey, this is a line in the sand. If everything becomes a line in the sand to you, well, nothing's a line in the sand. So it's definitely an interesting thing to think about how your values kind of interact with the structure around you. I don't know how much intentional thinking I've done about that, but it's definitely something that permeates life, right? You can't go through life without kind of internally going through like what your value system says about, how you act or react to different things around you. But I think having an open discussion about it makes you think about it in a way, in a different way. And it allows you to kind of think about, when you think about the process, you can change the process. So if you think about the decision-making process around your values, you can make changes that will improve your communication skills, and maybe help you align your values more closely with those around you.
It's also something where like you want to put systems in place from a company level, right? Systems in place where people can have different methods for raising these concerns, right? So if you're not comfortable jumping up and saying like, I have a concern, like maybe there's I immediately go to like the suggestion box approach, right? Maybe there's another method for you to be able to voice your concerns without necessarily standing up and saying it. Any team that I've been on, I've always, first of all, I've always made sure that I had a good relationship with my supervisor or team leader to be able to go to them and say like, hey, listen, this is what's going on. I've always been very focused on team morale and making sure the team is functioning at its best. Yeah. But part of that is also being a conduit for folks who don't necessarily feel like they can stand up and say something because, they don't want to, or they have anxiety around it, or, whatever the number of issues could be. I feel like it's one of those things, like if you have that teammate that's willing to like listen and say like, you know what, here's what I'm going to do. I hear your concern and I'm going to take this and I'm going to move it to the next level anonymously. And like, that's going to be on me. I feel like that's valuable.
I mean, that's also the value of retrospectives, like Cathy said. I mean, having a time and a place for these concerns in a process makes it more okay to discuss it. And that
team retreats
really
are a great spot for that. Yeah. Like we used to do that when I was with Oomph. We used to do that at our team retreats. So we've talked a bunch about, values. We've kind of dropped in some tips throughout. But I really want to jump into like tips that you both have for kind of maintaining your values in the workplace if the task directly contradicts. So Tess, you already provided kind of a great example where, you had a contradiction and you kind of brought some insight and some value to the conversation and kind of were able to shift that. Do you have any other kind of tips that folks could use to kind of get the same results if they find themselves in the same position?
I always find that working on compromise and bringing in all of the different, bringing your concerns to the fore is important. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's important to have, when it comes to particularly client discussions, to have more people talking to it. Because if you're only talking to one individual, mm-hmm. That means that there's a much narrower conduit for conversation, and you might not actually get very far with trying to start a compromise. Mm-hmm. Instead, if you have more individuals in it, you might get somebody's ear in that conversation and they'll talk to them, and that will have more weight to shift the direction of how that decision might go than you yourself might have. And that's important to make sure that you're actually interacting not just with another individual, but also with another organization.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a great tip, but there's a little sub tip in there, I feel like, and that's like it's a tip of a tip. I think that compromise, right? Being willing to compromise, right? If you come into this conversation and you're like, and depending on the, Nick talked about this earlier, depending on the level of conflict or the issue that you're coming to, you may not be movable on it. There may be no compromise in your mind. But like being able to compromise there, I think is super important too. Like that's a valuable skill. Cathy, what about you?
I think there's probably a lot of cases where not all the values match up between organizations and people. And the thing that I would try and talk to people about or read about would be to try and find something that's a shared value. So maybe it's stability, maybe it's ease of use, maybe it's cost. Like if I can make kind of a list of values for like maybe two sides and identify one or two values that are the same, and then be like, then we have at least like one shared value, and then
Common
we're
ground.
not fighting.
Yeah.
Now we're like collaborating to achieve that value with different perspectives. So I think I would look for like just one shared value.
Yeah, I think that's actually really insightful. And I think one of the reasons is it does two things. One, if you have shared value, let's take accessibility as an example again. If a client just doesn't care about accessibility whatsoever, right? But let's say they care about user engagement. And as a developer, you can do too. You can use the user engagement value that they have as a vehicle to be like, well, if it's accessible, more people can engage and your user engagement will go up, right? So you can use the values that they have there. And if you have that discussion and they understand that, hey, you might be compromising, and depending on the size of your organization and the number of layers between you, these types of discussions sometimes can happen. But if they know you're compromising in one area, they may be more willing to compromise in another area, as well. They, as
like
even
build
though
trust.
Exactly.
And make room for change.
That's what I'm trying to say. That's so much more concise. I appreciate that. So anyway, Tess and Cathy, thank you for joining us. This has been an interesting discussion. I'm glad, these guest host idea shows have been some of my favorite over the last year. They're always different than anything John or I or Stephen would come up with. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I mean, thank you for working with us and coming up with this topic. For our listeners, if they have thoughts, questions, or feedback on the discussion we had today, you can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel. And if you're interested in show notes, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Yes, you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. And Tess, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
I'm not all that available anymore, honestly. I still have my website, which is deninet.com.
Okay. And Cathy, if our listeners want to get in touch with you.
I'm YesCT on Drupal.org and also on Twitter.
And John, how about you?
Before I say that, I would like to take a second to thank Cathy for the last 4 weeks in joining us here on Talking Drupal. It's been fabulous having you, and we look forward to having you back.
You made it easy, and I encourage other people to try being a guest host.
There you go. You can reach out. There is a pathway for that. I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Have a good one, everyone.